What's going on YouTube? Welcome back to this video. Today we're going to carry over, we will pick up where we left in the intro to command and control servers. Reminding you guys that this room is part of the red team pathway in TryHackMe. Okay, so we finished the first 4 tasks, and today we're gonna take an example how to use command and control server. So basically the example today will be about Metasploit. We will cover this task: command, control, and conquer, and also we will be looking into ways on how to hide your command and control server using Metasploit. So I have the machine running, the lab machine, on which we will be conducting the attack. Now on the attacker machine we'll be launching Metasploit, and here our target is vulnerable to the eternal blue exploit. Now you might be telling me, I know how to exploit eternal blue, but actually this is going to be kind of okay. So here we're going to say search type. First we specify the type of the module. It's going to be exploit, and we're going to type eternal, indicating that we're looking for eternal blue exploit. So that's the one that we'll be using. Okay, so we're going to copy that and say use. We'll be looking at the options. So basically the first thing we're going to set the L host. Let me take a look at the IP address of this machine. So here we're going to say zoom in, if config, okay, so this is the IP address. If you're running the machine from the attack box, make sure to copy the IP address that corresponds to the ENS5 interface. So set lhost. Okay, now we're going to set lport. First, let's take a look at the other options. So we say show options. So we have the R port 445. Okay, other options we need to set are highlighted by the column required. So everything that is required or highlighted with yes has already been set. So yes, this one we have to set the R host. So we're going to go back and set R hosts. R host will be the IP address of the machine. Okay, now we need to set the payload. So no payload set here. Let's say we want to set a Meterpreter payload. So we're gonna say set payload Windows x64 Meterpreter reverse TCP, and then we're going to say run. Unable to find accessible named pipe. Let's take a look at the named pipes. So no set named pipes. Current setting is empty. Here named pipes, we have one. So exploit didn't succeed. Okay, well, looks like we have used the wrong one. So here it's PSExec. We want to use the eternal blue. So let's go back. So back. And again, we're going to do search one more time. So this is the one we want. So use. Okay, so the payload has been already configured, defaulting to Windows x64 Meterpreter reverse TCP. Now set lhost. Lhost is the IP address of the attacker machine. Set our hosts. Our hosts will be the IP address of the target machine. let's make sure everything has been set up correctly. So we have the L host, L port. This is the listener IP address, the listener port, the listener IP address, and the remote port is defined. The R host is defined. Now for the SMB pass and username, they are kind of not required, as you can see here, so they are optional. Alright, everything else is set, run. So let's take a look at this. As you can see, first, the exploit is conducting some sort of reconnaissance and scanning on the target using auxiliary scanner. So it is kind of verifying that the target is vulnerable to the eternal blue exploit. And then it found that the host is likely vulnerable to the vulnerability MS17010, and the target is running Windows 7 Home Basic x64. Now all the other steps, or the steps that come after, are about implementing the exploitation phase. Now after this succeeds, okay, we're going to take a look at how we can hide the connection. So most of the time, so what happened here? Fail. So we have a fail here. Anyway, let's talk about something else while this is running. So basically, guys, when you run a command and control server such as Metasploit and you actively exploit targets, you don't want people to report your command and control, because if it is reported, it's going to be taken down. Here I'm talking about if you have used a public command and control domain, like you have used set up a domain, and now this domain, you want to use it as a public interface. I'm going to talk about this in a bit. So we can hide the command and control server using Metasploit, but I have to remind myself with the process because it's kind of, yeah. So we have to configure something called the redirector along with Apache server. So what's the idea here? Let's go back up. Okay, so let's say instead of your local machine address, you want a local IP address, you want to use a public IP address or a public domain, because this attack might be external. So if you want to launch external attacks on targets that don't exist on the same network, you have to set the L host to either your public IP address or a domain name that you have just purchased. Now your public IP address must resolve to a domain name, otherwise you're going to face problems. So in both cases, you're going to have to buy a domain, set up domain, and link the domain with the IP address through name servers. So basically, if people reported the domain because of suspicious activity, everything will go down. You're not going to have the L host part here will become inactive because people reported your domain and now it's inactive. Most of the time, blue teams, when they spot suspicious activity on the network, they're going to report your L host. So your L host, if it is local IP address, is going to be blocked. If it is a public IP address linked to a domain, the domain will be taken down fairly easily and quickly by the registrar from which you bought the domain. So what's the solution here? How to hide the IP address of the L host? How to hide the L host IP address, whether it is public or private. So you have to configure something called the redirector. So through redirector, we are using Apache 2 web server as a proxy. So what happens here, when the exploit succeeds, the victim, in our case it's Windows 7, will be sending the callbacks. This machine will be sending the callbacks to the Apache redirector, and the Apache redirector I'm running will send these callbacks to my server. So I'm gonna be hidden. Your T2 server will stay hidden. Okay, let's see what happened with this exploit. Most probably, so it worked. Win. So now let's cover the questions here. What is the administrator's NTLM hash? So in Meterpreter we can use hash dump. Now we have the hashes. So we're gonna copy this. Okay. What flag can be found after gaining administrative access to the PC? So let's see here. shell. Who am I? So we had net authority system. Let's now go, so let's cd to the path, cd users administrator desktop. Type root text. So that is the root flag. Okay, what flag can be found after gaining access to Ted's user account? So that's easy. We can go back a bit, 2 steps, and take a look at the user. So we have Ted, cd Ted, cd Ted, and there we should find the flag, which is here. What is Ted's NTLM hash? Let's go up and find that hash. So this is the account and this is the NTLM hash. Okay, so this one is finished. All right. So let's now talk about how to hide your C2 server. Alright, so as said earlier guys, we have to use Apache along with Metasploit. So let's take a look at the current configurations of the Apache server running on this machine. So here I'm going to say clear cd etc apache 2 sites available. Let's see if it is running. Config available. Okay, so there are no current servers running on the machine. So it might be that we need to configure a web server. So basically that's how it works. So basically guys, we will configure a default site. So here, as you can see, we're going to create this file. So go back, make directory sites available, and inside sites available we're going to say nano test.conf, and here we're going to paste this code. If you are actively running a web server on your machine, you're going to do these steps. Okay, so what we are doing here, as you can see, we are using a rewrite engine. So in order to forward the requests from the target machine, in my case it's the machine I compromised, I want to forward all of the output. For example, when I issue a comment here, the victim will respond with a callback containing the output. This output is sent through a callback. Now this callback, instead of being directly sent to Metasploit or the C2 server, first it's going to be sent to Apache 2, the server that I'm going to run, right? Now you get the idea. And the Apache server will redirect the callback containing this output to my C2 server, hence my C2 server will stay hidden. In order to do that, we have to use a rewrite engine. Okay. So a rewrite engine will forward the requests based on specific criteria. Now my criteria really is the user agent. So say that the requests coming from the machine or the target machine, the callbacks containing this user agent. Okay. Now how do I know that? How do I know that the user agent is this, for example, not Meterpreter, or it can be anything else? Before conducting the attack, you have to use Wireshark, okay, and launch the attack and see what kind of HTTP requests are being sent from the C2 server to the target machine based on that, or the machine you are testing. Based on the characteristics of the HTTP headers, you're going to decide what is the criteria. It's going to be the agent, user agent. It can be another header depending on the scenario. So here we are saying that any callback containing this user agent is going to be forwarded to this IP address, or this on that port. So how to decide on this port? This is the port that hypothetically the C2 server is performing the callbacks to. Sometimes, now in that scenario we are taking today, it's using SMP to send and receive the commands and the callbacks. Now sometimes you might be using a Hey HTTP payload. In that case, you're going to send the callbacks through Hey HTTP. Okay, so what happens here? Your server, Apache server, will receive the callbacks on port 80, and it's going to forward all the callbacks containing this user agent, okay, to your C2 server that is running a listener on port 8080. Okay, now after we know what to do, let's start the first step, which is creating the payload. We can use MSF Venom for that. MSF, yeah, now mobile users will tell me zoom in. Okay, I'm gonna zoom in, no worries. MSF Venom. Now the payload will be, as I said earlier, guys, it has to be HTTP. So Windows Meterpreter reverse HTTP. lhost will be the public IP address or the domain name to which the payload will make the callback. So here it can be first 2 and 0, and lport, it has to be 80. Okay, the port of the web server is 80. And next we define what is the characteristics of the payload based on which the redirection from the web server to the C2 server will happen. It's gonna be here the user agent. So you have to set the user agent in the payload. So HTTP user agent equal whatever you want. Here we set not Meterpreter. Now this will create a payload that if executed on the target will make callbacks on the public IP address on port 80, and will have the user agent not Meterpreter. Now your public IP address here will receive the callback on port 80 and will check that the payload or the request containing user agent equals to not Meterpreter. It will then perform the rewrite or the forward to the local host. In that case, it's the machine running Metasploit. If Metasploit and Apache were running on the same machine, it doesn't harm if you put localhost here. But if your Metasploit is running on a different machine, make sure to put the IP address of the machine. So this is the IP address of the machine running the Metasploit C2 server, and here is the port that we're going to use in the multi-handler that we're going to configure in a bit. To do that, we use exploit multi-handler. Okay, now let's set the payload to, as again I said earlier, guys, we cannot use TCP. We have to use HTTP payload. So set payload Windows Meterpreter reverse. Okay, and now we set the lhost. Now, if you're running this attack publicly, you're going to change this. Okay. Again, one more time, if you want to truly hide your C2 server, this cannot be your public IP address. This should be your machine's address that's running the web server. No, I think I made a mistake. Now, if you're running this attack publicly, guys, the IP address here should be the IP address of the web server. It means your public IP address, Apache. Okay. Now, what happens here, as I said earlier, guys, I'm going to repeat again. The attacks or the callbacks will be sent to your web server running your public IP address, and people cannot report it because all the requests that are forwarded from the public IP address or the web server to the Metasploit are being done internally. Your Metasploit is actually running internally here. So we go back. Okay, the machine is stuck. Thank you very much. All right, so now we set the lhost to local machine. Set lport 8080. It has to be the same lport you use here in the proxy pass. Now we have to set something else. Reverse listener bind address. Reverse listener bind address. It's going to be your local machine IP or public IP address. Likewise, the reverse listener bind port will have to be the same. Alright, now there are other two things. They are the override lhost and the override lport. These are the redirector IP address. So we set override lhost. Now the override lhost, it's going to be the redirector IP address. In that case, whatever IP address you're using for the web server, you're going to input it here. Again, if you are doing the attack publicly, it could be your public IP address. So let's put some value here, 192.168.0.44. Now, if you are using a domain name, okay, if you are receiving the callbacks or on a domain name you have bought for your C2 server, you're going to set the override lhost to your domain name here. It's going to be the domain name. And set override lport. Now this one will be the port on which the web server is running. Let's go back here. The web server is running on port 80. So you're going to set here port 80. Okay. Now the last thing we need to set is the user agent. So the condition, the criteria for the Apache server to forward the request to my Metasploit C2 server is that the user agent will need to be this. So we're going to go back and set user agent not Meterpreter. And then lastly we're going to say set override request host true. This will make Meterpreter respond with the override host information. Okay, and then we need to say run. That's it. Now what happens, as you can see, you are binding to a loopback address by setting lhost to this. Did you want to reverse bind listener? And then as you can see, the reverse handler started on this address. Now again, guys, this is only a demo scenario, but if you want to run this publicly, you have to make sure to set the lhost here, change the IP address of the lhost, and the override lhost address. Okay. Now the override lhost address will be the public IP address or the domain name that you are using for the web server. Okay. And this, if you are kind of running the web server and the C2 server on the same machine, it's okay if you set this to the local host. But if you're running them on different machine, you have to set lhost to the IP address of the machine running the C2 server. It's going to be, of course, private IP address, local IP address. If you're running Metasploit with the web server on the same machine, it doesn't harm if you set this to lhost, because the request will come to port 80 on this IP address or the domain name and will be channeled through the rewrite engine to port 88 on this IP address, which is the IP address of the machine that's running the Metasploit or the C2 server. Make sure this can either be the local IP address or a private IP address on your subnet that's running the Metasploit or the C2 server. So that's how we effectively hide the C2 server if we are using Metasploit. Now, if you want to, after we have set all the configurations between the C2 server and the Apache, now it's time to go back to Metasploit and make sure to use this payload to, or with whatever exploit you want to use. This is the payload that we're going to use all the time. We use this payload meta-handler, and you're going to use the exact same payload, okay, with any other exploit module, because all the requests will be channeled through this payload. Now, what about other parameters? Like, what is the L host and the L port that you're going to set while using other exploits? The L port and the L host will be set the same. You're going to set L port to 8080, and L host will be local host, or the machine running the Metasploit C2 server. Let's go back and answer a couple of questions. So there are two questions here. What setting name that allows you to modify user agent field in a Meterpreter payload? So it is the user agent. What setting name that allows you to modify the host header in a Meterpreter payload is the host header, or HTTP host header. So this way, guys, we finished the C2 or intro to C2 room. Now you can go ahead and take a look at this sheet. It contains all of the available C2 servers on the market, free ones, open source ones, public ones, paid ones, and the comparison when it comes to, as you can see, the server, running the server, the multi-user, the implant, the version, the pricing, the operating system. This is a great comparison between the C2 servers. As you can see here, we have Cobalt Strike, Meterpreter, Metasploit, and many others. So what's the verdict now? Can we use Metasploit as a C2 server in advanced engagements? The answer may depend. So, because most Metasploit payloads and signatures are kind of registered as signatures in the security solution, so most probably it's going to be flagged immediately. But if you are using Metasploit and then obfuscating the payload after, it's completely different story. It depends on the scenario. If it is a complex scenario, or you know that your target has advanced protection set up, then it actually is recommended to stay clear from Metasploit. If you know that you can, or if you have capabilities to obfuscate the payloads or the malware that you're going to send to the target, or if the target doesn't run advanced protections, then you can go ahead with Metasploit. That's the final verdict of Metasploit as a C2 server.